Welcome back to another episode of the AthElite podcast. We have a special guest all the way from the United States of America, Mike Navratil. Mike, welcome to the AthElite podcast, and it's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So, Mike, for the listeners out there, give us a little bit of a background about yourself and what some of the sporting organisations and qualifications you've got.
Yeah, so I got into the field. Originally, I was a college athlete at Youngstown State University, which is a small Division I school in Ohio, and started getting involved as a student there as like a student worker, and then transitioned into like the internship kind of thing. So, doing the collegiate internships. I did one at Youngstown State and then University of Wyoming. And then, each step kind of just took another step into, a bigger role. And then went to a couple other schools. I went to Robert Morris University out in Pittsburgh, where I was a volunteer out there. And then was a graduate assistant at the University of Akron and worked with some sports there. Strength and conditioning specialist through the NSCA, and been in the field for almost 5 years now. So just transitioned into the private sector though down here in Texas, and just started doing that about a month ago. So just trying to start building that business side of things.
So what in the NCAA, any listeners don't know what that is. So it's basically in America university. So they call it college. Very high standard in sport and academics. So basically they go to university and they play sport at the same time. If they don't get the grades, they don't get to play. So very special and talented athletes and also highly academic people as well. If anyone that doesn't know what the NCAA is about. On this topic, what are some of the sports specifically that you've worked with in your college experience?
Yeah, so I started off working football primarily. That's kind of like the big internship, you kind of get into is working for a football team. And so I did a couple of that and then transitioned more into working primarily with basketball, and then worked with baseball as well, a pretty good deal. But the last couple of years has been spent mostly in basketball and, working with teams at Robert Morris and the University of Akron. So,
have you found that, training, the training principles and, the strength and conditioning between your football, how different is that to basketball? Because obviously, the ultimate goal, one of the main goals for a lot of those players, besides becoming a better player and improving, their sports specific side of things would be explosive power, I'm assuming, or some kind of power development.
Yep.
How do you find that the training differs between, your NFL or your football compared to your basketball?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lot different. I mean, I think the biggest difference is the kind of athletes you're working with. Football is more of like a grind kind of sport. The weight room is a huge aspect of football here. And so just in terms of development, I mean, if you look at the off season, from the months of January all the way through the summer, basically, they're not on the field practicing with the coaches except for a very limited amount of time. So a lot of the time is spent in the strength and conditioning side of things, whereas basketball is, I don't want to say we're more supplementary, but at the same time we are, it was more of, we had 4 hours a week with them, but they also practiced 4 hours a week in the summer. So it wasn't like, as opposed to football, it's all strength and conditioning, where now with basketball, okay, we're working year round. Okay, the first priority is basketball. And then our second priority was, now what do we do in the weight room to supplement it? So in terms of like developing explosive power, football is, I would say 100% done with strength and conditioning staff. Whether it's, your speed and agility plyometric sessions done, or, your conditioning, or in the weight room, with certain lifts you're doing. But then in basketball, it's tricky because they're practicing so much. So if you take a guy who's practicing a couple hours a day and then you're going in the weight room and trying to do really fast and explosive things with him, it's probably not going to end up very well. He's going to get overtrained. He's not going to be able to really develop that trait that you want him to. So taking a step back and kind of looking at, they're getting a lot of their explosive training through playing basketball anyway. So now we're going to step back and say, okay, well, now we have to work on everything else. So in one sport, it's the priority in the weight room, I think. And then the other sport, it's, you know, kind of working around that because they're already getting so much out of it from, playing basketball. So,
And the programs will be, especially with your football, it'll be super individualized because obviously a quarterback's role is completely different to a punter's role. And you've got linesmen who is all about speed and agility. So how exactly, like in the weights room, what are we looking at roughly between like how many days a week, how long they're in the gym, and all those kind of things between the different positions for the football players?
yeah, it's I mean, in the off season, you're typically, we have 8 hours a week with the athletes. So you split that up however you want, kind of in terms of doing stuff on the field, like speed and agility, running, plyometric, that kind of stuff. And then in the weight room. Um, and then in terms of individualized kind of training, it really depends on the program. I've worked for a program where they split people up into position groups. So you're lifting with your specific position group. And then I've also been at a place where the staff, we didn't have the staffing. So we had a lot smaller staff. We only had a couple, 3 guys, as opposed to a lot of schools have, 5, 6, 7 coaches in the weight room with interns and stuff. We weren't able to individualize as much. So it's more, in terms of like the main lift, like at Robert Morris, we didn't necessarily say the quarterbacks are going to do something differently than our offensive linemen. It was more individualized based off of percentages they were using, and then the supplemental things. So a quarterback doing more arm care stuff prior or supplemental to his main lifts. But in to kind of summarize, every place I've been, that they're the main characteristics are always throughout everyone. So you take, a quarterback and a defensive back, their program is going to look primarily the same, but there's going to be certain nuances, certain lifts. Like if a quarterback, you don't want them full bench pressing, a lot of places will board press or, just not even do it, do like landmine pressing to supplement. But other places, they bench press their quarterback. So it's kind of just a institution by institution difference, and kind of what kind of staff you have, how much time you have in the weight room, and that sort of thing. So,
And basketball, as you mentioned, it's a little bit different. So you train, and then if you got any spare time, then you work in the gym. So what is football? You got 8 hours a week. What does basketball look like in college settings?
in the off season, same thing, 8 hours a week. In season, we combine everything. So your strength and conditioning, your practicing, your film, it's all combined, and you get, I believe it's 20 hours a week in season. So obviously we spend a lot more time with them in season, but that's out of 7 days of the week, and they have to have an off day. So, it would be, heavy during the week, and then we would come in on a Sunday, and Sundays would be primarily just like a very light lift and like a mobility and rollout session. And then, our main training days are during the course of the week of practice. But, same thing with football, they have the same kind of timelines in season. It's going to be around 20 hours a week. And then you're going to be lifting, typically 2 to 3 times a week. And that's like separate from practice. So it would be like in the morning, you would come in and get a lift in, and then go to classes, and then, go to practice in the afternoon after that. But yeah, basketball is tricky. Just, I mean, it's going to change every week. Games are on different days every week. You're traveling to different places, so you might have a short week, as opposed to football. You're playing every Saturday. So the schedule is a lot more consistent in terms of scheduling, training, and kind of what we're doing with them.
So most of these guys in both sports, besides the obvious, genetic freaks they are, especially with football, they can bench, and they're so strong and so powerful, but they do train a lot. So it's not like, these guys aren't training
Yeah.
at all. They're just naturally gifted. They can throw a ball, or they can
Yeah.
tackle, or they can hit hard. These guys are training a hell of a lot, and they're working with,
Yeah.
specialists and their strength and conditioning teams, rather than, the coach isn't the strength and conditioning coach. Everyone's kind of got their own little role in the coaching side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you know, you have an entire staff developed to, creating athletic characteristics in these individuals year round. So like, you look at your head strength coach, that's his sole job is to develop a comprehensive program to basically make these guys better athletes than they already are, right? And like you said, a lot of these guys are genetic freaks. They're already really, really good athletes. So trying to get that extra, 1% out of them or whatever it may be is pretty difficult. And that's why they have the whole kind of encompassing team that works to just do that. So,
Are there any sports, between, we'll start with football and then we'll go to basketball. Are there any sports that you think, football correlates really well with another sport, like maybe wrestling and football? And then the same thing with basketball. Are there any sports where, you know, not that doesn't necessarily mean, they're professional at both sports, but they kind of correlate really highly. And you do see quite a few guys that are quite good at both sports.
yeah, I mean, I mean, a lot of football players previously played basketball, but typically a lot of college basketball players didn't play football. So, um, football, you're going to have a lot of multi-sport athletes typically in high school. It's very rare to see someone just play football. They're either going to be playing football and basketball or football and baseball or, whatever it may be. Whereas basketball, the AAU system here, which is our like club system for high schoolers, basically, that they travel all summer. They're playing year round. So even when they're not training with their high school, they're playing for their AAU team. So, I mean, I would say basketball is a pretty one-dimensional sport here, and it's kind of grown that way just because they're trying to specialize kids so early. But that's the cool thing about working with football players is they're really good all-around athletes. They're really good at doing a lot of things. They're going to pick up on things a lot easier in terms of, you know, doing drills, changing directions, jumping, that kind of stuff. Whereas basketball players that I've worked with are pretty, I don't want to say one dimensional in their skills, but they are more limited into the toolbox that they have in terms of athletic qualities for sure.
So they're a bit more, solely sports specific in that regards. Whereas, you can get a footballer, you got a whole football squad. What is it? Maybe 20 or 40 or 50, whatever it is, in a squad. And I'm sure there'll be a few that could easily cross over to wrestling or
Yeah.
basketball or track and field. Whereas basketball, you're not
Yeah.
quite going to get that same guarantee. Similar to in
Yeah.
Australia with Australian football, it's the exact same thing. Obviously, they're not as if you look at the average, they're not as big and explosive and as strong. Obviously, our endurance is a bit more important, but similar thing. We can get sure there'll be one guy that can go track and field or basketball or cricket. So it is quite interesting
Yeah.
because I think soccer um, would be the same as basketball in its own regard, like heavily reliant on agility and endurance, yet strength isn't their strength, if you like. But football, it is interesting how
Yeah.
football is
Yeah.
amazing, like one of the best athletes in the world.
Yeah. I mean, I think going off of that, I could take, let's just look at like defensive backs or, pretty good athletes on the football team, people that are, pretty fast, pretty agile individuals. If you take a defensive back, chances are you're going to be able to teach him how to play other sports fairly well. Not necessarily at like an elite level, but you could toss them in and they could maybe get by just based off of their speed and athleticism. But if you take a track and field athlete, for example, who all they do is run, and you throw them into football, it's like they have to learn a completely new set of skills. Instead of just running, it's like, okay, well, now they have to change directions. They have to run with an extra, additional weight and equipment and pads and all that kind of stuff. So I think like if I was gonna say I'm trying to cross sports, I would definitely take my first sport I would go to would be taking a football player and trying to make them play a different sport rather than vice versa. Because I just think it's not that football is a hard sport, but just the kind of athletes that you have in various sports. So
Yeah, besides the obvious genetic beasts they are, most of them, there's a lot more
Yeah.
variables in that sport, which means they have to be good at a lot more variables. Basketball, if you're a point guard, you need to be quick, you need to be alert, you need to have good reactions and anticipation skills. In football, you need to be fast, you need to have, you know, unbelievable agility, which we'll touch on in a sec. You need to be explosive, you need to have power, obviously different positions, require different, anthropometries and different kind of sizes and strengths and stuff. But yeah, they're pretty special athletes. But on that topic, with their agility, what kind of agility drills are you guys doing? Because you see some videos and some of their training at the college and in the NFL. They're they're quite explosive and so good off the line. Like it's a whole different ball game, and you hit the nail on the head. It's a whole different ball game, running in a straight line and Usain Bolt style, 100-meter sprint. When you got to change direction, it's a
Yeah.
completely different ball game. So, what kind of drills do you guys do to develop that agility?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of it is like, I mean, being able to decelerate really well and accelerate really well, right? So you can't change directions without being able to stop yourself. So a lot of the stuff we do, is in a confined space, and it's reactionary. So I mean, you're gonna have drills where it's, let's take a box cone drill. You have four cones, and then you say, here's the pattern you're running, do this, right? And that's just like a easy way to, okay, you're going to change directions, you're going to have to slow down, speed up, etc. But then there's also a lot of drills you can do, and I learned this at Robert Morris. More so was more reactionary kind of drills. So okay, we're going to really try to like dial in on these kids' senses. So let's say we have um, two individuals facing opposite directions. You blow a whistle, they turn each other, and the one person has to try to get past the other person, right? Because in sport, you're never going to have a box that is set up and you're going to run in a box pattern, right? That gives you the ability, and it teaches, okay, here's how you stop, here's how you speed up, here's how you're going to do it, here's positioning to work on. But at the end of the day, you have to train those reactionary senses for individuals to go into sport and say, okay, like, you're not going to know what's happening. You're not going to know where a linebacker is going to pop up. You're not going to know in basketball on defense where, the defense is going to be. It's just all reactionary. And so I think in terms of agility training, yeah, train those confined spaces, train those specific drills to where it's more the individuals know what's coming, but then you also have to progress that to teaching them, here's what, here you don't know what's going to come, so now you have to kind of figure it out, adjust. And I think the more you can do that and the better you get at doing that, the more comfortable you are doing it during a game, right? So if I've never done something before, I'm probably not going to try to do it in a competition. But if I'm rehearsed on being explosive and changing directions when I'm not expected to, then I'm going to be more likely to feel comfortable doing it in a game. So,
And a lot of coaches can't differentiate between, change of direction and agility because
yeah.
agility training is purely off reactions, like working on that reactive agility, not only for sports enhancement, also injury prevention because ACL injuries, the number one, um, and I put a tweet out there the other day, the number one kind of risk is changing direction rapidly due to reacting to
Yep.
a stimulus. That's the number one um, kind of risk with doing an ACL injury. Yet reactive agility training, a lot of people and strength and conditioning coaches can't even differentiate between planned change of direction training and that reactive agility training that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much you can do with it, and it's kind of like, you know, you have to break before you can. You have to learn how to, break yourself before you can learn how to, take off, right? So it's like just giving these guys some qualities and stuff. I mean, the first thing I ever do in terms of working with an athlete is teaching them how to land properly and teach them how to plant properly. So it's like, and obviously it's going to change in game. They're not going to do it every time the way that I teach them, but just teaching them how to, bend their knees and hips, not be so stiff when they're landing or preparing for another movement is big, I think. And it kind of goes by the wayside, I think, a lot of the time. A lot of it's like, how fast can we run? How quickly can we do X, Y, and Z? But, slowing it down and kind of starting from the basics, I think is, just as vital.
Previously, you mentioned about working in the private sector at the moment. Can you touch on exactly what your role
Mhm.
is in the private sector and kind of you're pretty new to the private sector, so what a bit more information about what exactly is going on with your work there?
Yeah, so I moved down to Texas, and then I worked for a company called Cliff Drysdale Tennis, and they own just a bunch of tennis clubs all over the country, and a lot of their facilities also have gyms. So I just work at one of their fitness facilities as a trainer, and um, it's been interesting. It's a lot different than the collegiate side. The collegiate side, you're handed, I guess I'll use the word clientele. You're handed a clientele. You have the teams that you have. I was given, the teams that I work with. And then now, I transition into the role where I have to, go out and find my own business. You have to create clientele. And we were talking before about, finding that niche and kind of, um, working to find who do I want to target. I primarily try to target athletes just because that's my background, and I think that's what I am most proficient in working with. But also trying to just, like we said again, like trying to put food on the table. You have to just kind of. I'm going to train a lot more variety in this aspect than just working with really high end elite athletes. So kind of just like, it's a challenge for me, working with a 12-year-old kid who's never lifted a weight, I think makes me a better coach, makes me take a step backwards and really focus on proper progressions, proper, teaching points, stuff like that. Whereas, a lot of the athletes that, I'm handed already have that experience and already have, experience in the weight room and on the field and, whatever it may be. So there's very different, but, also like similar in terms of how you should go through things.
Yeah, it's so easy. Training athletes, obviously we're trying to get that 0.5% or 1% better. um, but it's so easy where you can just say, warm up, this is what you've got, see you later. They know the technique. They probably just need a little bit of a spot, especially if they're training like maximal strength and really explosive or really heavy lifts. But when you're training,
Mm-hmm.
those other clientels where it might be kind of like an exercise physiologist role, um, where you really have to, some people, like you said, that they could be not just 12 years old, they could be 40 years old, 50 years old, and never trained in the gym before. And you really got to, this is how you warm up, this is how you do this lift, and really start with the basics. Um, it is a massive challenge where if you're not used to it and you don't know how to communicate, sometimes, the best way to communicate is you got to, it's almost like the cue is you got to speak like you're speaking to someone on the phone. Whereas you got to imagine that
Yep.
if you have to explain and they can't see you and you've got to talk on the phone, how would you say it? It is interesting, um,
Right.
communication. Some coaches, um, they, and I think this what differs between the really good coaches and the not so good coaches is their ability to explain those complex ideas and simplify them. Um, but yeah,
Yep.
it can be a massive challenge because you get different clients and different listening and different learning abilities.
Yeah. In the span of 3 hours, you can work with, I'm working with a professional basketball player right now. And then I'm working with just, an individual who just wants to come in and lose weight. And then there's a, 10-year-old kid that his parents are making him come in just because they want him out of the house or whatever it may be. So it's just, having three completely different ends of the spectrum and just trying to navigate those. And like, you have to change. Like with the basketball player, obviously it's 100% performance driven, like what's going to make him the best on the court, you know. And then I go with this lady who's just trying to, come in and lose some weight and be a little healthier. And it's more of like an encouragement role, and, teaching her very basic stuff, talking to her about her nutrition, talking to her about habits, stuff like that. And then I go to this, young kid who's 10 and, he doesn't know how to run, and just trying to like teach him how to run properly and like jump and all that kind of stuff, like very basic movements. So it's interesting, and I think that it's exciting because it gives you that kind of that range. You know, obviously I love working with athletes, but you know, everybody, in my opinion, is performance driven to some extent, right? Whether it's that the lady who wants to just lose some weight, you know, everybody wants to perform their best and feel their best. So you kind of just got to cater it just like I would any athlete with these individuals.
Mike, thank you very much for being a special guest on the Athlete podcast. We've got some awesome insight um, into mainly the collegiate side of things, which is something really new to a lot of these Australian listeners. So thank you very much, Mike. Looking forward to seeing how you progress in the future with, working more in the private sector at the moment. And once again, thank you very much for being on the Athlete podcast.
Thanks. I appreciate you having me, and good luck with everything.